claim to know what Clem is going to talk to us about. All I know is that those South Africans know what Clem Sunter normally talks to us about. Scenario, situations, the fox and what? The fox, mind of a fox, of the fox in the mind. Don't know how it works. So yeah, you know, we'd like to invite Clem to the podium to inspire us, to talk to us about what he sees in the future when he holds his crystal glass. You know, so whether we do boom or bust, Clem, in the future. And I also want to make an announcement that Clem's books are outside. Those who are interested in buying his books are autographed because the author is right on site. They're very much available outside as well. So yeah, with that, let me invite Clem Sunter to talk to us.
Good afternoon, everybody. What a pleasure to be here at such a prestigious conference, and I hope that by the end of my presentation I'll have persuaded you to become foxes. I'm going to divide my talk into three parts. Firstly, to explain the methodology that Chantal Ilbery and I use now to help people look at the future. Secondly, I'd like to talk about the flags that are changing the global economy, because some of them affect tourism. And thirdly, I'd like to obviously come closer to home and give you the latest possibilities for South Africa. I guess the story starts in 2000. I met this young student at UCT, Graduate School of Business. Her name is Chantal Ilbery. And we decided to collaborate on writing a book called The Mind of a Fox. And we chose that title because we want to get across to people that if they are looking at the future and trying to develop strategy, that they should have the attributes that that small animal has, of having very bright eyes and looking out and surveying the environment, and particularly looking at what the flags are that are changing the environment for you as a business, and then obviously having the speed and agility of that animal to adapt your strategy to the changes in the environment. That's why we called it The Mind of a Fox. When the book first came out in June 2001, it wasn't that successful, but then something happened which turned it into an overnight hit, and it was the best-selling book of any title in South Africa in 2002. And in 2003, it was number 2 because Harry Potter was number 1. So what was the event that propelled it into the bestsellers? It was 9/11, because what we decided to do in the book to get across to people how useful this methodology was to publish a letter we'd written to George Bush when he first became President of the United States. And in it we said that part of his legacy as President would be determined by how he adapted his strategy to certain extreme futures that might come in his direction. And we nominated as his number 1 extreme future in the book a massive terrorist strike on an American city which would completely transform his presidency and possibly lead America into a gilded cage where it shut itself off from the rest of the world. And of course it happened 3 months after we published the book. Thank heavens we didn't get it exactly right. We didn't have planes flying into buildings. If we had, I wouldn't be here at the Manslow. I'd probably be in Cuba. Which actually is an important point to make, which is that we actually talked of a possible nuclear event in an American city, and we talked of nuclear terrorism in the letter. And you're never going to get an event exactly or in terms of timing unless you have inside information. But what you can do is get the idea of a particular event in advance of it happening. And we had 2 flags that we felt were blowing in the wind to nominate this as his principal threat. The first flag was the growing confrontation between the major religions of the world in the late 1980s, early 1990s, particularly Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And the second flag was the two attacks on American embassies in 1998 by Al-Qaeda, one in Kenya and one in Nairobi, one in Kenya and one in Tanzania, which we felt was a dress rehearsal for the real thing in America. And we've always thought that if we'd been allowed to present our flags to the security agencies in June 2001, they might have reperceived some of the genuine flags that they were getting that we knew nothing about. It came out in the congressional inquiry after 9/11 that there was a young woman in the FBI who went to her boss on 6 occasions and said, "Boss, there's a flying school down the road where Arabs are learning to take off but not land." Big clue. But it was ignored on the grounds that Arabs were too incompetent to attack America on American soil. And that's exactly the kind of assumption that foxes will interrogate by offering alternative flags. So overnight we became quite famous. The White House bought 10 copies of our book. The only person to quote from it, and I'm not sure whether this is an asset or a liability, was Donald Rumsfeld during the Iraq War. He talked to the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns, the things you know you don't know, and the things you don't know you don't know. And we make a very big thing of that in the book, because however good a futurist you are, there will always be major events that totally and utterly blindside you. In my case, I had no inkling of the Arab Spring before it happened, before that young student set himself on fire in some Tunisian city. So, you know, you've just got to accept that even with the best methodology in the world, sometimes the future will take you totally by surprise. So that is the core of our technique, is to look at the game-changing flags and then, if necessary, paint best-case and worst-case scenarios around those flags. And it's not just the ones that are to do with the world or a particular country. The ones we really concentrate on are the ones that are changing your particular game. So if I was doing a facilitation for one of your companies in tourism, I would be looking at what the flags are that are changing the tourism game at the moment. I mean, one of the flags which is changing every single business game right now is the internet. And, you know, the question is, have you adapted your strategy to that reality, or have you tried to sort of just sweat it out? We do work for the newspaper industry, and it's quite clear that newspapers are a dying game, because most people pick up their information off the internet and also watch CNN or Sky News or whatever it is. So the only way that newspapers can save themselves is through the commentary on the news, and having the kind of commentary that The Economist has to make sure that you can differentiate yourself from just picking up a news item on the internet. And certainly in tourism, I mean, all the websites now that offer you accommodation like Airbnb, all the services like Uber, which are based on mobile devices and the internet, are changing the tourism game. And my question to you is, have you actually adapted your strategy to those changes? Just like there's one media company in South Africa that has done that, and that's Naspers, which bought Tencent, the Chinese internet company, and actually is now the third largest player on the internet, according to The Economist, after Google and Alibaba. So there's a South African company that saw the future and adapted its strategy. So what are the flags now being raised by our global clients? Because we do about half our work overseas and half our work locally. And what are the kind of flags when we talk to our clients? What are the ones that are changing their future that are sort of generic as opposed to specific to a particular industry? Well, the first flag, unfortunately, is the religious flag. It is flying, and I mean, it's unusual that people should start discussing God in the boardroom, but they have to, because it is affecting large chunks of the world. I mean, we've got total anarchy in Syria and Iraq at the moment. The Americans have actually spent $6 trillion on the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, that's more than a third of their GDP, only to actually have a situation that is even worse than when they started spending the $6 trillion. That's a problem. But it's the fact that it's moved outwards and is affecting other countries that is beginning to make it an issue that you have to consider, whether it impacts your business. Nigeria, you have Boko Haram in the northeast of Nigeria, and the question is whether Nigeria at some stage may even be split into two different countries as a result of the Muslim north versus the Christian south. As you know, tourism in Kenya has been affected hugely by the Westgate shopping centre incident. I mean, the last statistic I got was that hotel occupancy in Nairobi is down to 18%. And, I mean, the question is, what are the scenarios now for Al-Shabaab in Somalia in terms of, you know, future attacks on Nairobi? You have to consider it, particularly if you're in the tourist industry, because people are very afraid of going to places where they could be killed. And obviously another country that is applying to now is Thailand, after this British couple were murdered yesterday. Here in South Africa, the flag is down. The religious flag is down. We're the one country in the world that has Jewish CEOs with Islamic CFOs, because the profit motive is more important than religious differences. But of course, we do have tourists, and you have to worry, particularly at Christmas time, when we have lots of foreign tourists in places like the waterfront, to make sure that no attacks take place right here in South Africa. The second flag that particularly our European clients now want to talk about is the red flag, Mr. Putin. He has completely and utterly changed the economic prospects for Europe with his annexation of Crimea. And, you know, you have to now start thinking of where the new Cold War will lead. Only 2 years ago, people were talking about Russia joining the European Union. And now the flag is that we have, you know, sanctions. The question is, are they going to be ratcheted up? Russia itself has said that if Europe goes to a further level of sanctions, they'll ban all European airlines over their airspace, which will completely and utterly impact the European airlines if they do that. So it's a very important flag to kind of play out in scenarios, because who knows what's going to happen. Meanwhile, Germany, which is the champion economy in Europe, faces the worst future of all because it is the most integrated into the Russian economy. It's the largest exporter to Russia, and of course it consumes 40%. 40% of its energy comes from Russia. And as you know, at Christmas time, Germany is quite a cold country. So, yeah, that flag is now becoming very much a talking point with our clients in Europe, and whether, in fact, the European recovery has been totally choked off. The third flag is an interesting one because it comes from a conversation that I had 2 years ago at another hotel in this area, the Michelangelo up at Sunter. It was an MIT alumni function, and it was for South Africans who've been to MIT, and they had about 6 or 7 members of the faculty out here at this function. And I was the guest speaker, so I did my whole thing on scenarios and flags. And this young woman came up to me afterwards and said, I really found your talk fascinating because my previous job before I joined the MIT faculty was head of scenario planning at US Homeland Security. So I said to her, gosh, that's interesting. I mean, I don't often talk to somebody who advises the White House about threats to America. Why don't we have lunch together? And I have to say that after lunch, one of the other professors came up to me and said, you know who you had lunch with? The real-life model for Claire Danes. But apparently Claire followed her around for 6 months to get an idea of what it was like to be in Homeland Security. Anyway, I said to her at lunch, you know, what are the threats to America? You don't have to reveal secrets, but just give me a feel. Well, the first one was an obvious one. It was terrorism. But she did make a very prophetic point. She said, we actually think we've got the external strike nailed down, so we don't think there'll be any more 9/11s. But she did say the real worry now is people in America suddenly flipping and causing harm in America, and that was pre the Boston Marathon bombings. But of course now America and Britain is very worried about all those ISIS fighters who carry American and British passports going home and causing harm in their own country. But it was the second threat that nearly made me fall off my chair. She said, climate change. And I said, you're kidding. Climate change is a security threat to America. I mean, most Americans regard climate change as a conspiracy. And Al Gore as a Hollywood wannabe who makes movies about climate change to make money. And she said, I'm not kidding you. We have more access to data on climate change than any other organization on earth. And I can believe that, having listened to Edward Snowden. And she said, the phenomenon is for real. And she said, in your terminology, there are 3 flags to watch on climate change. Number 1, temperatures. She said, you know, we have billions of data on temperatures, and yes, there are places in the world that haven't warmed up over the last 50 years, and in fact there are places where temperatures have declined. But the vast majority of the world has warmed up. And then she said something interesting. The first victim of climate change will be Australia. And again, she was prophetic, because last year, 2013, was the hottest record ever in Australia since records began. And they've had to introduce a new colour for meteorological maps in Australia, deep purple, for places where the temperature is in excess of 50 degrees, between 50 and 54 degrees. I don't know how many of you have walked in temperatures over 50. I have, in the Kimberleys, which is just above Broome in Western Australia. I walked in 52, and it's like walking in a microwave. You can't walk very far. But the critical thing about Australia, which they're now obviously monitoring in Canberra, is the rate of evaporation of water, because water is a critical resource. And even now they're playing scenarios that the centre of Australia will gradually be depopulated because there simply won't be the water there, and people will have to migrate to coastal cities where at least you have desalination plants replacing the natural water from rainfall. So it is a flag for Australia. The second climate change flag she referred to was rising sea levels. And she said, obviously, the first nations to be hit are all those little island groups in the middle of the Indian Ocean and Pacific. But then she specified 2 cities in America that are very vulnerable to rising sea levels. The first one is New Orleans, and that's why they have decided to abandon certain suburbs that were ruined by Hurricane Katrina. They're simply not building the levees because it's too expensive with the rising sea level. And the other city is Miami, because it has a tidal bore around the coast, and it's rather like the Bristol Channel. And the most affluent suburbs are right on the coast, and they could easily be damaged over the next 10 to 15 years. Just to show you what the economic impact of flooding is, I have a friend who has a house overlooking the Thames that was flooded in January with that major floods in the UK. Before the flood, his house was worth £3 million. After the flood, £1 million. He lost £2 million as a result of the flood. So, yeah, my advice is don't buy one of those houses on the rocks in Camps Bay. The third flag, and she said this is the one that's going to change people's behavior about climate change, is the increasing frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. And she said, you know, Americans honestly don't care about climate change except for the fact that when they have twisters in places like Oklahoma and they do destroy suburbs, that's when people start responding. And in fact, last year was a hideous year for twisters, not only in Oklahoma, but in Illinois, and this year in Nebraska. It's not in the news, but if you Google California, California is going through the worst drought in 150 years. And indeed, some of the small towns in the center of California have run out of water, and it has to be trucked in. They're even trucking the salmon up the rivers because there's not enough water for them to swim. And they only have one chance to spawn, so you have to give them a chance. Obviously, there have been extreme weather events elsewhere in the world, such as taking place at the moment in India and Pakistan. But the point of this is that it can lead to very different rules of the game at the next climate change summit, which is going to take place fairly shortly, in terms of trying to reduce carbon footprint. And of course, that will impact on travel. And I don't know what will come out of it. Obama's issued already an executive order calling for a reduction of 30% in carbon emissions from coal-burning power stations in America by 2030. He issued an executive order because he knew that the Republicans would have nixed it in Congress if he had tried to put it through Congress. But it's a very important flag, this, because it could mean the next generation live a completely different life to us. No more Fortunas. Whatever. We'll just have to see how that flag plays out. The fourth flag is the one that is currently affecting the world the most. It's the grey flag. It's the aging of the human population. Just one statistic says it all. In 1900, the average lifespan of an American or a Brit was somewhere between 42 and 45 years. By 2000, it had risen to 83 for males and 86 for females. So as a human species, we more than doubled our lifespan in 100 years as a result of medical advances. We were a relatively short-lived species for most of the years we've been in existence. Now we live longer than elephants. And this has had a phenomenal consequence on the global economy. All the baby